Welcome to Chapter 10, The Presidency. American presidents have frequently assumed greater powers during times of crisis. President George W. Bush claimed that in order to protect the country from the threat of terrorism after September 11th, the president needed broad powers to conduct military operations, gather intelligence, and detain enemy combatants, and thus he established the Department of Homeland Security. I am sure that all are familiar with how the President of the United States is considered to be the most powerful person in the world, primarily because he is the leader of the nation with one of the most powerful economies, greatest military forces, and longest-running representative governments in the history of the world. This reputation is reinforced by the media's coverage of the president and his activities. We look to the president for a reaction or a response or solution if anything significant happens, from terrorism to changes in the economy to natural disasters and foreign turmoil. We want the president to solve our problems and represent our nation in times of triumph and tragedy. We also expect him to be strong and resolute, but willing to compromise. These are often unrealistic expectations for any leader or elected official. The irony is that the U.S. Constitution provides for a weak chief executive, and this actually conflicts with the expectations of Americans and the rest of the world. The formal rules of the Constitution limit the presidential powers, while the informal rules have helped to expand them. The presidency is fundamentally different from Congress, and it centers around one individual and people who have an emotional reaction to that person. Recall that the founders feared a strong central executive. It is clear from the Constitution that the framers intended the president to defer to Congress when it comes to government authority. Although the Constitution has not changed much on the subject of presidential authority, the framers left room in the Constitution to allow the president to become more powerful. Presidents are now seen as more powerful than in the early decades of the United States. That power increases their ability to serve as leaders and to influence public policy. At the same time, with that increased power and prestige, modern presidents receive disproportionate blame for economic problems, domestic policy failures, and foreign policy problems. Each president inherits a presidency considerably more powerful than the institution imagined by the Founding Fathers due to the actions of his predecessor. Ironically, national emergencies present some of the biggest challenges to presidents, but they have also been the situations that have had the most influence on strengthening the office. The president is expected to be all things to all people. Current presidents are often compared to past presidents, and the public is disappointed when presidents do not live up to the legends of those that served them before, although they overlook the fact that much of the time legend is not reality. Even presidents who are now considered great were criticized and distrusted by some. Unlike other officials, presidents are measured for greatness. The myth of presidential greatness encourages a series of performance expectations that are contradictory at best, and at worst, impossible to fulfill. And don't forget, if you want to read the Constitution and check out these different articles, it is printed in the entirety at the end of your book. The president is poorly defined in the Constitution. Time, precedent, and the actions of a few aggressive presidents have expanded the office. Article 2 of the Constitution establishes the presidency, but actually says very little about it. If you remove the passages on the technical requirements of the office, you are left with 2 paragraphs defining what the president is supposed to do. The framers of the Constitution were intentionally vague about the executive power of the president. Their experiences with a strong executive were not good. Remember, they did not like the monarchy, and their intention was to create a strong legislature which would control the powers of the executive branch. By vesting the executive power in the president, Article 2 also implies that the president serves as America's head of state and is, therefore, entitled to special deference and respect. The office has grown through time and precedent. For example, here are some examples of the presidents. George Washington set standards for how the president is to be addressed and how long he should serve, 2 terms. Andrew Jackson created a direct presidential connection to the people. Abraham Lincoln claimed unilateral power for the president to act in crisis situations through his execution of the Civil War. Theodore Roosevelt held the philosophy that the president was limited only by what the Constitution prohibited from doing. Franklin Delano Roosevelt presided over unprecedented expansion in the size and scope of the executive branch. Lyndon Johnson established the White House as the center of policymaking. Richard Nixon went to war with Congress over his attempts to expand executive privilege. And Ronald Reagan used his technology and strong communication skills to move public opinion and congressional opponents. On the basis of Article 2, the presidents have three types of power. These are called the express powers of the office, the implied powers, and the delegated powers. A fourth type of power is claimed by presidents does not appear in Article 2 at all. This is called the inherent power of the office. Let's first talk about the express powers, because these come directly from the words of the Constitution and are specifically established. These fall into several categories: military, judicial, diplomatic, executive, and legislative. The president has the power to wage war, but the Constitution's framers intended the president's military powers to be secondary to Congress. Today's world has changed that. The president holds many advantages over Congress when it comes to military policy. The president can move American forces overseas and commit them to battle. The president has the organizational resources and structure in place to keep him abreast of international developments. The president can act swiftly and unilaterally, and the president can move public opinion once he acts. These powers are among the most important exercised by the president. His position of commander-in-chief makes the president the highest military authority in the United States, with control of the entire defense establishment. He also heads the nation's intelligence network. The swelling of the president's military powers followed the growth of the United States as a world power. Congress tried to fight back with the War Powers Act of 1973. The War Powers Act was proposed to limit the president's ability to initiate military action without congressional approval, by requiring the president to consult with Congress before taking action and mandating the approval of Congress when troops are committed to military action without a formal declaration of war. If the president's actions aren't ratified within 60 days, or 90 days if the president declares the shorter timetable would pose a risk to the troops, the president has to bring the troops home. However, presidents have ignored this act, and Congress has not tried to challenge them. The chief of state is also the nation's symbolic and ceremonial leader. Many nations separate the symbolic and political function of their leaders, like Great Britain, which gives a largely symbolic role to the Queen and a political role to the Prime Minister. The next power is the judicial power of the president. Pardons are unconditional and no reason needs to be given for them. The presidential power to grant reprieves, pardons, and amnesty involves the power of life and death over all individuals who may be a threat to the security of the United States. Presidents may use this power on behalf of a particular individual, as did Gerald Ford when he pardoned former President Richard Nixon in 1974 for all offenses against the United States. Or they may use it on a large scale, as did President Andrew Johnson in 1868 when he gave full amnesty to all Southerners who had participated in the late rebellion. The president's use of the pardon can be very controversial, and pardons are often not well received by the media or the opposing party, or the general public. In short, the pardon power is like a pressure valve, and when used properly, which certainly is not always the case, it can keep the judicial system healthy by weeding out those who were not intended to fall into it. And like I said, when Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, that was after Watergate, and that he used the rationale that the nation needed to move on. And it's also true that pardons can be used to do the biggest of political favors. The president, like I said, is America's head of state. He or she is the chief representative when dealing with other nations, and has the power to make treaties for the United States with the advice and consent of the Senate, as well as the power to recognize other countries. In the United States, the president also receives ambassadors, a power expressly granted in the Constitution that gives the president the right to extend American diplomatic recognition to other nations. In recent years, presidents have expanded the practice of using executive agreements instead of treaties to establish relations with other countries. An executive agreement is the same thing as a treaty because it is a contract between two countries that has the force of a treaty but does not require Senate approval. Typically, Congress has agreed to executive agreements in place of a treaty. One other thing to note about executive agreement is that they can be completed much faster than a treaty, which must pass through the Senate, which is one of the things that makes them very popular with presidents. The most important basis of the president's power as chief executive is to be found in Article 2, Section 3, which stipulates the president must see that all laws are faithfully executed, and Section 2, which provides the president will appoint and supervise all executive officers and appoint all federal judges. The Constitution states that the Senate must give advice and consent over appointments. There is controversy between the Senate and the executive branch over what advice and consent means in the Constitution. The senators seem to think that this means their preferences should be listened to, whereas presidents suggest it simply means they have to listen to the Senate before they make their own choices. The president usually gets what he wants in top positions in executive agencies and in courts. He typically will appoint loyal partisans, close advisors, and close friends. However, this can sometimes be at the expense of an appointee that has the appropriate knowledge, qualifications, and skills to do the job. Ambassadorships are often given as rewards to people who help the president get elected. So the legislative power is also very important. There are two constitutional provisions that are the primary sources of the president's power in the legislative arena. The first of these is the provision in Article 1, Section 3, that the president shall from time to time give to the Congress information about the state of the Union and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. Delivering a State of the Union address may at first appear to be little more than the president's obligation to make recommendations for Congress. But as political and social conditions began to favor an increasingly prominent presidential role, each president began to rely on his yearly State of the Union address in order to become the primary initiator of proposals for legislative action. And he also gets to be the principal source for public awareness of national issues. The president also has the authority to veto bills that are passed by both houses of Congress. Some presidents do not have to formally veto legislation because the mere threat of a veto is enough to convince Congress to modify the legislation to the president's liking. The veto is the strongest legislative weapon the president holds. A veto threat is a public statement issued by the president declaring that if Congress passes a particular bill that the president dislikes, it will ultimately be vetoed. Sometimes this can be a costly strategy for presidents, as a veto threat can take away some of their bargaining later. This is because by issuing the veto threat, all of his or her cards are laid on the table. Presidents are much more likely to veto legislation under divided government. Congress can play the veto game too by sending a popular bill and putting him in a precarious position of vetoing a bill the public wants. There have been 2,582 presidential vetoes since 1789, according to the U.S. Senate website. President Trump has vetoed 8 bills with no override. Some other examples include FDR, who had 635 vetoes and 9 overrides, President Obama with 12 vetoes and 1 override, and George W. Bush with 12 vetoes and 4 overrides. Our first president, George Washington, had 2 vetoes and no overrides. If you check out figure 10.1 in the chapter, it will show a flowchart of the veto process if you want to take a look at it in more detail. Although not explicitly stated, the Constitution implies that the president has the power of legislative initiative, which is the president's implied power to bring a legislative agenda before Congress. The initiative implies the ability to formulate proposals for important policies, and the president, as an individual with a great deal of staff assistance, is able to initiate decisive action more frequently than Congress. This is because Congress has many more members and has to deliberate and debate before they can actually take action. Legislative liaison officials maintain ongoing contact with Congress and lobby for the president's proposals. An organized, efficient, and tireless administration can approach Congress from a position of strength. The president will find his lobbying efforts enhanced if he has political capital in the form of an election mandate, a strong professional reputation, or high public prestige. Circumstances beyond the president's control may also affect the success of his agenda. The timing of the president's actions is crucial to the outcome. Executive orders are directives to the bureaucracy. They do not require congressional approval, and they carry the force of law. This power derives from a broad interpretation of the line in the Constitution that states the president is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. The courts have generally upheld the president's right to issue executive orders. Most executive orders are procedural or of little interest. However, some presidents have used executive orders to bypass Congress and create public policy. Examples of executive orders include Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, Harry Truman's desegregation of the military, and FDR's internment of the Japanese during World War II. Executive orders cannot violate U.S. law, but congressional legislation can overturn an executive order. Other presidential decrees include administrative orders, national security directives, presidential memoranda, proclamations, and findings. The list of expressed powers for the president is brief, but each expressed power has become the foundation of a second set of presidential powers, the so-called implied powers of the office. An implied power is one that can be said to be necessary to allow presidents to exercise their expressed power. Presidents have made much of the very first sentence of Article 2, which declares, "The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America." This grant of power, along with subsequent admonition to presidents to see to it that the laws are faithfully executed, as well as the president's oath of office, have been cited by successive White House administrations as their justifications for actions that are not expressly sanctioned by the Constitution. The president's use of the implied powers often sets the stage for conflict between the Congress and the president when they don't agree on how he's using them. Delegated powers are powers exercised by the president and the executive branch that are not found in the Constitution. These are the products of congressional statutes, also known as laws and resolutions. Over the past century, Congress has voluntarily delegated a great deal of its own authority to the executive branch. This delegation of power has been an almost inescapable consequence of the expansion of government activity in the United States since the New Deal period, since the government now has so many broad responsibilities. Congress cannot execute and administer all of the programs it creates in the law it enacts. Because of this, Congress must turn to the bureaucracy, which is the hundreds of departments and agencies in the executive branch, to implement their goals. We'll talk about the bureaucracy separately in another chapter. Presidents have claimed a fourth source of power beyond expressed, implied, and delegated powers. These are powers not specified in the Constitution, but are said to stem from the rights, duties, and obligation of the presidency. They are referred to as the inherent powers and are most often asserted by the president in times of war or national emergency. President Lincoln relied upon a claim of inherent power to raise an army after the fall of Fort Sumter. Similarly, Presidents Roosevelt during World War II, Truman during the Korean War, and both Presidents Bush, first during the Persian Gulf War and then during the wars in the Middle East, claimed inherent powers to defend the nation. We talked a little bit already about the War Powers Resolution, which was passed in 1973, where Congress tried to restore their role in military policy. However, presidents have regarded, like I said, this resolution as an improper limitation on the inherent powers of the presidency and have ignored the provisions of the War Powers Resolution. President George W. Bush claimed that the inherent powers of the presidency gave him the authority to create military commissions, designate U.S. citizens as enemy combatants, and authorize the National Security Agency to monitor phone conversations between the United States and other nations following the attacks on September 11th. President Obama continued to rely on the concept of inherent power in ordering drone strikes against suspected terrorists and ordering American airstrikes in Libya. The War Powers Resolution and the back and forth between the executive and legislative branches over military power in the post-World War II era is a great illustration of the murkiness of the inherent powers. Originally, the president had virtually no staff. Now the president has at his or her disposal a variety of formal and informal resources that have important implications for the ability to govern. Collectively, these individuals could be said to make up the institutional presidency and to give the president the capacity for action that no single individual, however energetic, could duplicate. The first component of the institutional presidency is the president's cabinet. The cabinet is a traditional but informal designation for the heads of all of the major federal government departments. Cabinet secretaries are appointed by the president with the consent of the Senate. This body actually has no constitutional status. The American version of the cabinet meets to advise the president, but makes no decisions as a group. And since cabinet appointees generally have not shared political careers with the president or one another, they may meet literally for the first time only after their selection. The formation of an effective governing group out of this diverse collection of appointments is highly unlikely. And as you probably know, people come and go from the cabinet positions during the president's terms. The White House staff is composed mainly of analysts and advisors who are closest to and most responsive to the president's needs and preferences. Although many of the top White House staff members hold titles like advisor to the president, assistant to the president, deputy assistant, and special assistant for a particular task or sector, the judgment and advice they're supposed to provide are a good deal broader and generally more political than those coming from the executive office of the president or from the cabinet departments. The members of the White House staff also tend to be more closely associated with the president and may have come from his or her campaign staff. The job of these people is to not only advise on policies, but also to give recommendations on what the political implications are of any decision. The executive office of the president is made up of between 1,500 and 2,000 highly specialized staff members. The president's staff are equal to the task of proposing legislation and countering Congress. The president also engages in regulatory review by determining how agencies should operate. The use of regulatory review, along with things such as signing statements, all fall under the broad category of the administrative state. The executive office of the president is made up of numerous staff members and cabinet-level officials that assist the president in making political and policy decisions on a wide range of matters, and is a major part of what is often called the institutional presidency. Presidents have increased their administrative capabilities, and they have also increased White House control over the bureaucracy through regulatory review. Congress delegates administrative agencies to establish rules and regulations on congressional statutes. Power to prepare a budget is not specifically granted in the Constitution. As the federal government took on more responsibilities in the 20th century, the executive branch grew in size. As chief executive, the president assumed a larger role in creating the budgets for these new departments. The president's expanded budgetary authority was formalized in the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921. Key provisions include the requirement that the president submit an annual budget proposal to Congress, the establishment of the Office of Management and Budget to assist the president in formulating his budget, and the establishment of the General Accounting Office, which is a congressional office that investigates budgets to ensure the accountability to the executive branch. The budget gives the president a forum for presenting his priorities. In a Congress controlled by the opposition party, the president's budget recommendations will likely be dead on arrival. In a sympathetic Congress, one that shares the same party as the president, the recommendations are given serious consideration as they are more likely to share priorities. The vice presidency is a constitutional anomaly, even though the Constitution created the office along with the presidency. The vice president exists for two purposes. One is to succeed the president if he should die, resign, or become incapacitated, and two, to preside over the Senate, casting a tie-breaking vote when necessary. The main value of a vice president as a political resource for the president is electoral. Traditionally, presidential candidates choose running mates who can win the support of at least one state, preferably a large one, but otherwise likely to support the ticket. Another rule about choosing the vice president is that the nominee should provide some regional balance, and where possible, some balance among various ideological or ethnic subsections of the party. The vice president is most important because in the event of the death or the incapacity of the president, he or she will succeed the nation's highest office. This is the most important role. During the course of American history, 8 vice presidents have had to replace presidents who died in office. One vice president, Gerald Ford, who wasn't even elected vice president, found himself at the head of the nation when President Richard Nixon was forced to resign as a result of the Watergate scandal. If you know that story, you'll know that Richard Nixon's original vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned, and then Gerald Ford, who was the Speaker of the House, became the vice president. and then Richard Nixon resigned, making Gerald Ford the president,